And tonight's speaker, folks, I got 5 pages of things to talk about this man. So sit back, relax, turn the lights down, because I got a lot to say. Actually, I'm going to keep it brief, though. I am going to just say a few things about Hugh before we let him take the stage. Hugh is from Hot Springs, Arkansas, and is the son of a former dean of the University of Arkansas. He graduated as president of the class of 1966. I was 4 years old. Yeah, I just thought I'd mention that. At Hot Springs, and enlisted in the Army as an airborne infantryman in February of '67. He was selected to Officer Candidate School, was assigned to the School of Armory and Cavalry, graduated in '67, and was selected for ORWAC, and flew A and B model Hueys, and participated in the pilot program to focus on students in the UHB-1 gunship. I'm going to skip down because he's going to be sharing a lot of this, but here's what I want to share with you. Hugh was decorated with 3 Silver Stars, 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses. When he landed his OH-6 during a firefight, and he captured an NVA officer at gunpoint during a mission. Hugh was awarded a Review Aviators by receiving the Bronze Star for valor on the ground. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, our speaker, Hugh Mills.
That was not the smartest thing I ever did, but it is something I did. Thank you for having me. It was interesting to hear the introduction of the services. You say, how about the Army? Hoorah! How about the Marine Corps? Hoorah! And he said the Air Force, and I heard somebody say, turn up the air conditioning. That's very, very typical. As was mentioned, I'm from Hot Springs, Arkansas. I grew up there, went to school there. My next door neighbor in Hot Springs was Billy Clinton. Billy was class of '64. I was class of '66, but we've been dear friends for all that time. My dad was the superintendent of schools when I grew up, and then he went off to the university after I went in the Army. But I started with a failed academic endeavor at the University of Arkansas, where I lasted for 6 months, scoring straight A's in ROTC and the Sport Parachute Club. Everything else was an abject failure. So that told me a little something. You know, I ought to look for something that I could do those skills with. So I enlisted in the Army in February '67 as an airborne infantryman. Went to basic and AIT, went to jump school, and while I was in the final week of jump school, I got an opportunity to go to Officer Rotary Wing Aviation course, which is ORWAC. And so at the age of 19, as a second lieutenant, I went off to Army Flight School. That lasted for a year. I was promoted to first lieutenant after a year. 2 weeks before I deployed to Vietnam. And so on the 1st of January 1969, I deployed to Vietnam as a brand new first lieutenant. Still 19. I would not turn 20 until April of '69. But what I thought I would do today, I'm going to show you a series of slides that was shown at the National Air and Space Museum several years ago. But it'll give you an overview of a particular unit in Vietnam, which is really very little known about it. And I think you'll find it's fairly unique, and that's the Air Cavalry Troop of the United States Cavalry Squadron. And I'm going to go pretty quick, and we'll cover that. If we have any questions, holler out, and I'll be glad to answer them. This is mostly pictures, mainly for the Marine Corps in presence. You're welcome. These are the 3 units I served in. I served 3 tours of duty in Vietnam as an Air Cavalry officer. D Troop, 1st of the 4th Cav, was Dark Horse 69 and 70, part of the 1st Infantry Division located in 3 Corps. D Troop 3rd of the 5th Cav, Charlie Horse, was 7172, located with the 101st Airborne Division in I Corps. And then my third tour, I extended, and C Troop 16th Cav, part of the 164th Aviation Group in Canto in 4 Corps. So I served in 3 tours, all the landscape of Vietnam except 2 Corps. I flew through it once, but I was never based in 2 Corps. Have you guys ever seen this saying? You ever seen that? Do you know who said that? That's the guy who said, "You don't want the Lone Ranger, you want the whole United States Cavalry when you're in trouble." And the guy that said that was Scott O'Grady. Scott O'Grady was an F-16 pilot that punched out in the Bosnian theater and did an amazing job of escape and evasion, and then was rescued. Of course, it wasn't the Air Cavalry that got him; it was the damn Marine Corps. It was a photo op, I know it was. Aviation organizations in Vietnam include, and I'm going to look behind me once in a while because I can't see that far behind me. There were air assault divisions for the first time in Army history in Vietnam. The 101st Airborne Air Assault, the 1st Cavalry Division Air Assault. There was one Combat Aviation Brigade, the 1st Aviation Brigade, the largest unit in Vietnam throughout the entire war, and the last unit to case its colors in the war. Every division and separate brigade had aviation battalions, cavalry squadrons. I'll talk about those a little bit more. In the Armored Cavalry Squadron, there was one Air Cavalry troop. And in the Air Cavalry Squadrons, there were 3 Air Cavalry troops and 1 ground troop. There were a few separate Air Cavalry troops, and then there were separate companies toward the end of the conflict. This is an Air Cavalry troop, a typical Air Cavalry troop of the period, and it was commanded by an 04, 32 aircraft, 55 wheel vehicles. Most of those were for organic support. The typical armored cavalry squadron could not support the logistic requirements of an air cavalry troop in Vietnam. They didn't use JP-4, different weapons. And so generally the air cavalry troops were placed under an attached status with the aviation battalions. 10 officers, 38 warrant officers, 130 enlisted. 4 platoons. The Aero Scout platoon, which is what I commanded 2 of the 3 tours, had 10 086s, 2 vehicles, 2 officers. In my case, we only had 1 all 3 tours, and 10 warrant officers. The Aero Lift platoon had 10 UH-1s and 2 officers, 18 warrants, 20 enlisted. The Aero Weapons platoon was the gunship platoon. They had Cobra gunships when I was there, 10 of them. And then the very unique organization, which is the Aero Rifle platoon, or the ARPS. In my opinion, the thing that makes the Air Cavalry troop the most interesting and well, that won't work. Okay. The Aero Rifle platoon was a 28-man rifle platoon, organic to the Air Cavalry troop. They lived with us. They billeted with us. We put them on the ground, and then we stayed with them. And you'll see some good shots of that as we go through here. But the ability to scout with the Aero Scout platoon, the ability to dominate ground with the Cobra platoon, the ability to pick up 28 guys in your own unit and take them into combat with those 10 UH-1s made us an extremely flexible and unique organization. Our principal missions are here. Reconnaissance and security are the classic missions of the cavalry. Armed attack with the Cobras, hunter-killer teams, which is the way we arrayed 90% of the time, with Loaches and Cobras flying together. Downed air crew recovery. While I was there, we recovered 37 downed air crews from all services. We picked up naval aviators, Air Force guys, Vietnamese pilots, and a whole lot of Army helicopter guys. Tactical emergencies would allow the troop to scramble day or night to support troops in contact. Ground reconnaissance with our aero rifle platoon. Eagle flights was a flight into enemy territory, which was any territory outside the wire. But it was normally conducted with Vietnamese military police. We protected them in the white mice, as they called them, because of their helmets, would conduct credential checks of local civilians. And then we also, with our ground guys, did LRPs, observation posts, and listening posts. The units that we came in contact with, largely when I was there, 69 and on, it was NVA main force regulars, very few Viet Cong. The Viet Cong guys were the guys that would come out at night and harass the perimeter, but those that we fought in main force battles were NVA regulars. Predominantly light infantry, sappers, light artillery, 122 rockets and down, very little in terms of towed artillery. And AAA would include anything from a 50 down to a 30 cal RPGs in 3-core, and then up in I-Corps, we faced 85 millimeter twin radar guided guns in 1972. Later in 72, our unit was one of the first to lose an aircraft to the SA-7 Strela. The low threat essentially meant we could fly anywhere at 1,500 feet until the Strela was introduced, and then once the ground-to-air missile was introduced, everybody was down flying nap of the earth in 70. The typical scout mission was flown 4 to 6 feet off the ground. This is an 086. I'm going to talk more about this as we go along. This is where we started. You've all seen MASH. Some of you, from the looks of you, lived it. This is the OH-13. Korean War vintage. Are there any Korean War vets here? That was an interesting program you got coming up in July. The food alone would bring me there, absolutely. This is the Bell H-13. Those were the first scouts that went to Vietnam. The H-13 was a reciprocating engine where the OH-6 was a turbine. But these are the first scout aircraft that actually deployed into the theater. This is the Hiller H-23. That was the other old aircraft. This is actually the aircraft that I went through flight school on. This was my primary trainer at Fort Walters until we moved to the UH-1 series at Fort Rucker. In 1965, the Army Aero Scout Replacement Program tested 4 aircraft against each other in a long fly-off. The winner of that was the OH-6 from the Hughes Tool Company, later renamed the Hughes Helicopter Company, and the Hughes is for Howard Hughes. It won the fly-off with the Bell 4 and the Hiller OH-5. 317 shaft horsepower turbine engine derated to 272 horsepower based on the transmission. Ceiling of 12,500, I can honestly tell you I've never been to 12,500 feet in an OH-6. I did go to 10,000 feet in an OH-6 in Vietnam just to see if I could do it, and it scared me, and I came back down. This is a Y-OH-6A. This was the first version of the OH-6 in the stateside colors. This is what the aircraft looked like in Vietnam. And this, just to show you what Air Cav guys look like, that is the Nomex flight suit, 2-piece. This picture is 1972. The guy on the left is a Huey pilot from our organization of Dark Horse. Huey pilots like to come over and hang out with scout pilots because it made them feel better about themselves. The Cobra pilots would not do that because they already were very presumptuous about themselves. This is the operating area of an OH-6. In my particular unit, we flew with one pilot in the front, one gunner in the back, and a minigun, General Electric M134 with 1,500 rounds belted. Cyclic rate of fire, and you'll see it in a minute. Cyclic rate of fire was 2,000 and 4,000 shots a minute. But if you shot it at 4,000, you didn't shoot it for long. The gunner is in the back here. That M60 machine gun is a free M60 gun. It's held on with that bungee strap simply to keep it from falling out of the aircraft. It was handled by hand. That wooden box at the gunner's feet had 3,000 rounds of linked ammo, and then all the way along the bulkhead in front of the gunner we carried smokes, Willie Pete, frags, thermite, concussion, all types of ordnance that would be employed by the gunner in the back. Pilot's compartment is in the front. That armor that you see is the gray substance there around the pilot seat. That's the only armor on the aircraft. That's it. Pilots wore a front chicken plate that was ceramic fiberglass over tungsten carbide steel. The gunners generally wore a double plate front and back. And then right here, that little device there is a piece of canvas holding a piece of ceramic fiberglass armor. That's the only armor in the airplane. And you'll see some shots in a minute that show you how exposed you are. This is the minigun on the OH-6. That red thing on there is called a bullet catcher. We put that on there at night because when the weapon is loaded, if you turn the barrels by hand, it will fire. And I can tell you a whole lot of guys had problems accidentally turning those barrels, and we injured folks. So they developed a bullet catcher. I can tell you one thing you don't want to do is take off in the middle of the night on a tactical emergency and arrive over the target and immediately engage, having forgotten to take the bullet catcher off your minigun, because the barrels will fill up very, very, very quickly. Not that I personally ever did that. It was my crew chief's fault. One of the things, and you'll see probably in some of the other pictures, the markings on the top of the tail boom there, we painted the top of the tail boom white because you couldn't see the aircraft at 1,500 feet. They're so small. And so in order to have the Cobra who flew over us and watched us know where we were as we were talking, and he was writing down on a map the things that we saw on the ground, we put high observation paint on the top of the aircraft, on the tail boom and on the tail. This is one of my gunners. He's simply pointing to a bullet hole that came through the aircraft. But this shows you how they actually flew. This is the position that most of the half in, half out. They were attached to the aircraft on a thing called a monkey strap, which was about 4 or 5 feet long. I have lost 2 gunners out the door on their monkey strap because they got excited and tried to shoot under the tail boom as we were departing an area. But they don't fall very far, and all you got to do is go find an open area, land, and they get back in. It does get their attention, however, when they do that. This is me departing Lyke in 1969. I show this simply to show you this is how exposed the pilots are. That gray part there is all the armor I got. I'm wearing a front chicken plate. Jimmy Parker is my gunner who flew with me most of 69. That's him in the back seat. And the pilot is responsible for flying the aircraft. The gunner protects the aircraft. And then we do the talking, and the Cobras above us would do the writing. So as we're flying along at 4 or 5 feet, looking at combat traffic, we were trackers primarily, combat trackers. And our job was to find the enemy, mark their locations, lock them in place, and then we'd usually put the ARPs on the ground to develop the situation. This is the AH-1G gunship. This is an early G model. The early ones had a landing light in the nose with a clear cover. This particular aircraft has 19-shot rocket pods on it, and then the inboard stores are Su-18 minigun pods. on both sides. And then in the nose, we had an M134 minigun and a grenade launcher. Personal markings were encouraged. This happens to be Dean Steiner's aircraft. This is a Cobra up top that was one of my personal favorites. I flew this one in 1972. We put 2 miniguns in the nose, and then on the left inboard pod we had the Vulcan 20 millimeter cannon, which was a super large minigun, 20 millimeter. And those sponsons on the side under the wings are the 20 millimeter gun ammo packs. And they were on both sides of the aircraft, and the ammo actually fed under the aircraft's belly and were all expended out the left side. This is the manner in which we flew into combat every day. The scout pilots like myself rarely used a map. I did carry a map, a very large one, a 1 to 250, but you can't fly a single pilot and read a map and low level at the same time. So the map reading was done. This picture was taken from the front seat of a Cobra, and that's how we flew out, usually on formation on the left side of the Cobra. He would pick an area that we were going to go and look at and give me a visual sign on the ground. Do you see where the two streams come together? I want you to come down there and then take up a heading of 270, and I'll tell you the end of your boundary. And so I do that, and then as I'm flying around the air survey, I'm calling off what I see. I've got a trail east to west, light traffic, 8 to 10 people in the last 24 hours. They're writing this stuff down and they're marking the grid coordinates on the map. And once that particular mission was complete, that information goes to the Division G2 and becomes developed intelligence. Interestingly, in Vietnam, for you active guys, the Air Cavalry Troop was generally attached to Division G2, not the G3. It was an intelligence organization rather than a operational organization. Once I got my guidance on where he wanted me to go down, usually we'd do a wing over, straight down to low level, and then we would begin to work. This particular shot is a training shot. When we were training a new scout pilot, we would put him in the front with us and go without a gunner. And then after a period of time, you switch seats and let him fly. And then when you cannot tolerate the fear of a new scout pilot flying you around any further, you let him go on his own. You had to be careful in situations like this. If you had a child riding on a water buffalo and you flew over the top of him like this, the water buffalo takes off for the hills with the child aboard, and you make the farmers mad. But this is the normal altitude at which we operated, 4 to 6 feet above the highest terrain. This is the view of the scout ship from the ground. This is what the enemy could see. This is Highway 13. This is February 1969. Highway 13 ran from Zion, the headquarters of the 1st Infantry Division. You remember Zion, I know you do. Up to Lai Kay and then on up to Quan Loy, An Loc, and Loc Ninh. They ran convoys up and down that road every single day, and every single day we would go up there and run route reconnaissance in our aircraft for those guys, looking for precisely what happened here. You see that hole in the road, that's a mine. We didn't call them IEDs. We didn't know what IEDs were. They were just mines in '69. But this particular truck hit that mine and had been burning for a while by the time we got up here on this particular engagement. That's the same truck. When it quit burning, these infantry guys are walking around. But you see how big a hole that was. That was a large explosive that took that truck out. And you can also see the vegetation right up on the ground. This is vegetation that has already been roam plowed. This is not deep, thick jungle. This is plowed jungle. That'll come back in a matter of days. And you'll see some more of this in just a little bit. I apologize for the graphic nature of this, but these are the two NVA soldiers that blew that truck up. That thing on the right there is Jimmy Parker's M60, and he just took those two guys out. and the third one right here. And the thing that I think is important here, this is an RPG gunner that was in a spider hole 15 feet from the roadway, and the infantry sweep that morning missed him. Now, why would an RPG gunner hiding from everybody have a red backpack that he's carrying with him? I've never understood that, but that's how close. This is the engagement distance between my scouts and the enemy on a daily basis. We perform river convoy patrols. This is a convoy patrol at Canto and Four Corps, early morning and last light. What we're doing is we're looking at folks moving in boats to determine whether they're good guys or bad guys. Can you tell if this is a good guy or a bad guy? There is one crystal clear way to tell. Anybody want to take a shot? What's he doing? He's not looking at you. The friendlies will look right at you, they'll smile, they'll wave. The enemy troops would not make eye contact. They pretended to be invisible. What is actually underneath that mat in front of him is a cache of AK-47 rifles. This is when the gunner had the camera in his hand before the M6. But you can look right down into the boats. We dealt with boats this size, very small, all the way up to 40-foot trawlers on the Mekong River. One of the occupational hazards of flying an 086 in the environment we flew in was running into things. We damaged as many aircraft running into things. In this one, my crew chief had just painted a beautiful set of gold cavalry sabers on the front of my aircraft, which I thought was really cool. And then I went out that afternoon and ran into the top of a dead tree, which I didn't see in a quick turn, and flew back with the entire bubble blown out. And I remember Jimmy saying that afternoon, he says, I ain't painting another one. And he didn't. One of the principal weapons we faced was the RPD 30 caliber anti-aircraft gun, hand carried, drugged through the jungle on these little wheels. But when they flip it up in this position, they were a significant threat to aircraft. That's a 60 millimeter Chinese mortar on the other side. For any of you who have read Low Level Hell, this is from the chapter called Hot Dogging It, when early one morning I had the fortune to pop over a tree line in front of an NVA heavy weapons platoon, strung out from left to right over a large open area. And they didn't hear me coming, and I didn't know they were there. So the meeting engagement that occurred for about the next 6 minutes was significant. This is the one that I feared the most when I was flying Cobras. Not so much scouts, because we were usually over these guys and gone before they could open up. This is the 51 caliber heavy machine gun. This thing would tear a helicopter up. The next bigger gun that we would face on occasion was the 14.5 millimeter, which looked a lot like this, just a bigger bullet. This one we captured in the Iron Triangle and actually put a hook on it and pulled it up into an 086 and flew it home and parked it in front of the commander's orderly room, which is where that picture was taken. This is me, July the 11th, 1969. I got hit with a bullet that came in directly into the front, and it hit the left side of my armor plate. It went through my right hip, hit the armor plate behind me, and ricocheted out to the left side of the aircraft through my left hip. If you watch Forrest Gump, that's buttocks, both of them. And the aircraft went down on its side, and I was able to, that's me, but most of it's me crawling out. But this shows you the exposed nature of the aircraft that we flew with. This is what it looked like when the aircraft was recovered. The wonderful thing about an 086 is that it's built on a truss A-frame. And that truss A-frame runs right between the two doors and behind the rear door. and it allows the aircraft in a crash configuration to shed the tail, to shed the rotors, and to shed the landing gear, and it rolls itself up into a ball, and you just crawl out. And all of my experience, I've only seen one post-crash fire in an 086, and that was a pilot who landed on a tree stump vertically, and the fuel cell exploded. He survived it. He was badly burned, but this is what an 086 looks like after it crashes. One of my favorite pictures, I occasionally would go out on the ground with our ARPs because I was 20 and not a lot smarter. And I enjoyed going on the ground because I got to get into bunkers and see what the guys on the ground saw, and I enjoyed being with those guys. That morning, my roommate, Rod Willis, reached down and picked up my chicken plate, and he drew a bullseye on it with a grease pencil. 3 days later, I go out flying with that in its carrier, and I got hit where you see those two marks on the chicken plate. And my roommate and I had a long conversation after that, but when I got ready to go out on the ground, I put that on just as a joke, and they took a picture of it. But I got to bring that home with me. This is typical helicopter pilot uniform. This is circa July '72. You can tell that you look at the back of the 086. This is after the Strela was introduced. That's an SA-7 diversion device for the exhaust. It diverts it from the back up into the rotor blades. When the SA-7s were first introduced in the Delta and during the Easter invasion, we didn't have anything to counter the infrared signature of the aircraft. So this was an attempt by Hughes to divert that infrared signature up into the rotor blades, and it worked pretty well. The typical SPH-4 flight helmet, this is Ken Colby, one of my warrant officers. That's the chicken plate he's got on his chest. You see the manner in which the pistol is worn. That comes from a false belief that the positioning of that pistol will prevent any long-term damage to essential equipment. I think that's the best way to say that. And this, I can tell you, if you got hit on a pistol there, you would come away a high tenor. Probably the most interesting shot of my 27-year career as an Army officer. This is third tour. As I was tooling down the river, this is taken from a Cobra. I was taken under fire by an enemy 51 caliber that's over here. I turned into him and hit the minigun, and as I did, a round went through the aircraft, completely through it, and pierced a Willie Pete grenade that was in the back seat with my gunner. At the exact moment it exploded is when the Cobra pilot took this picture. I kicked the aircraft out of trim 90 degrees because Willie Pete burns and will burn through you, and it burns continuously. The gunner who's sitting in the middle of that was not burned one iota. His name's Jimmy Christie. We lost Jimmy 2 years ago, but if you can imagine a Willie Pete blowing up in your car, Jimmy was not damaged in any way. He was a Baptist. I took note of that and converted almost immediately. I was a Presbyterian. Presbyterians probably would have gotten blown up, but this is how you fuel helicopters in Vietnam. This is called a FARP, Forward Area Refuel and Rearm Point. It is unattended. Each of the bases around that we flew into had these fuel pumps. They were driven by a generator and a pump. And when you got there, you'd send the crew chief out to start the generator and get the pump going, and then we'd fuel here and then hover down a little bit and throw on extra ammo and rockets and all that for the Cobras. But you can see this is out in the middle of nowhere. That's Nuad Ba Dinh Mountain in the background in 3 Corps. That's a good shot of a crew chief hanging out. That's Mike King, who was my assistant platoon leader in '72. Interesting paint scheme on this aircraft, because we got this aircraft from 7th of the 1st Cav at Vin Long when they stood down, and our operations tempo was so heavy at that point in time that we didn't take the old markings off. We just put our new markings on over it. The dark horse markings are the Disciple of Peace and the red and white flag. You look under there, you see a silver spur. That was from 7th of the 1st. And then the upside down white triangle was their unit flag marking, and ours was the up pointed triangle. And then our platoon insignia was there on the engine doors. This is a typical flight over Vietnam when we're going from point A to point B. Generally, if my crew chief wanted to, they'd get up in front with us, and we'd let them fly the aircraft at altitude wherever we were going, because they enjoyed it. And there were cases in Vietnam, never with me but with my roommate, where he was severely injured, and the crew chief climbed out over the minigun in flight and went from the back door to the front seat and actually flew the aircraft home. The landing was not stellar, but it was functional. Lots and lots of hours waiting on the ground. This is Chi Lang, Vietnam, on the Cambodian border. We did operations in '72. That's me sleeping on the skid, and Kolb again in the back seat there, hanging around. But we'd go out, fly generally an hour and a half or 2 hours, come back, rearm, refuel, wait while another team was out, and then when they came in to rearm and refuel, we would replace them on station. This is 17340, which was the last aircraft I flew in Vietnam. This aircraft hangs from the ceiling of the Army Aviation Museum at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And I am so thrilled with that, because it is the actual aircraft. It's not a replica. And as I mentioned, we lost Jimmy 2 years ago, the crew chief, and this aircraft will survive long after the pilot and the crew chief are gone. So that's a real treat for me. This is just a shot flying with a Cobra. This is how we flew with each other, point A to point B. They were essentially the guys that led us around. All we did was follow them. If you got bored and they weren't paying attention to you, you could slide real close in and put your blades underneath their blades and get a rotor distance away from their canopy of about 2 or 3 feet until they looked around and saw it and made us move off. That's Gladiator. This is an interesting shot. I was training a new scout pilot on this particular day, and his name is Jim Adamson. Most of you would probably not know who Jim Adamson is, and even if I told you he was a West Point graduate and a future head of the physics department at West Point, you would know him better as Army astronaut number 3, James Craig Adamson. And I was training Jim one day to be a scout pilot. And we were out in the rice paddy area, and we were following a trail of guys that had hit the concrete plant at Muckwa the night before. And we were tracking the retreating force back to where they were. And as we were out there, you can see the trail right there. They walked that at night. And as we got out there, I looked down on the ground and I saw a smoking cigarette butt. And I told Jim, I said, within 100 yards of where we are right now are the guys that were smoking that cigarette butt, because that cigarette butt's still smoking. And I said, they're most likely in here, probably around that tree. So we went in, made a big turn, looked straight down the tree, and 4 sets of eyes were looking straight up at us. And Jim Adamson was so mesmerized by that sight. He had never seen an enemy soldier before. I had to tell him, I said, Jim, I'd appreciate it if you shoot those guys, because they're about to shoot us. But we had just dropped the smoke on them to mark it for the Cobras. Cobras came in, did the hit, and then we were back in again. Once we had a target on the ground identified, the Hueys would crank up. The ARPs, which kept all their equipment on those Hueys every day, would load up. We flew with 4 aircraft in the primary assault, all full of aero riflemen. This is the way they flew into combat in an echelon formation. It maximized firepower on all 4 sides of the aircraft for self-defense. Formation flying, which is not done anymore in the Army. It's sad, but tactically it's not needed. The ability to fly with overlapping rotor blades was a significant skill that was practiced every day. Once we got close to the landing zone, the ARPs in the Hugh in trail formation and descend into the landing zone, which had been prepped by the gunships. Once on the ground, that's Bob Harris, the ARP platoon leader most of 1969. We lost Bob several years ago. Bob's at Arlington. This is, where's Doc? This is Doc Morgan. This was our medic. Doc Morgan was a Episcopal minister in rural Athens, Tennessee. And he was a conscientious objector, but he did not avoid the draft. He avoided carrying weapons. So finally the troop commander said, Doc, you gotta carry a weapon to protect your troops. Begrudgingly, he carried a .45, but I never once ever saw him take it out. And one particular day, these guys got hit in a landing zone, and we had 2 guys out in the middle of the landing zone that were hit. And Doc, from the cover of the tree line, stood up and ran to the middle of that LZ and grabbed both those guys and got them back to cover. And that's when I switched from Baptist to Episcopal, because I don't know how in the heck he did that without being hit. But he later told me, I see Doc every year at our reunion, but he said the Almighty and I are on a good relationship. And I told him I wanted him to stand by me more often. Once the ARPs are on the ground, they begin to move toward the location that we want them to look at. This is the 2nd platoon leader. That's Stu Harrell. He came to us from the 82nd Airborne Division. That is a rare picture of Stuart wearing his helmet. I have no other pictures that I know of. Stu always carried his helmet or he put it on the ground because he didn't like to wear it. But this is the terrain that they moved in, and as you can see, you don't have great visibility there. If you're in heavy jungle, this is what your visibility is like. And so to guide them, we would use red smokes on enemy targets. The scouts would deploy those smokes, and then our job was to protect these guys as they moved. We scouted the area ahead of them before they moved through this grass, because it's very, very hard to maneuver, and you could walk right up on an enemy soldier if you weren't careful. As you can see, that vegetation is over their heads. This is Roy and Toy. Both of these were NVA soldiers who came over to the government side in a program called the Chu Hoi program, our Open Arms program. These guys were called Kit Carson Scouts. They were ethnic Vietnamese. Both of these guys were NVA. They were brothers. They both came over to the government side, and in order to deal with these guys, they knew exactly what they saw when they saw stuff on the ground. And when Roy and Toy stopped and tensed up, it was about to hit the fan without fail. This is Sergeant Gwynn, Staff Sergeant, Arvin Army. Gwynn was assigned to our unit to be the liaison not only with local forces but also with our Kit Carson Scouts. We had 6 of them. And of course, he was an ethnic North Vietnamese, taught English in Hanoi before the war, came south, joined the Arvin Army. The only member of our unit that I cannot locate, and I fear he did not do well after Vietnam fell. Gwynn was a wonderful guy. We all thought a great deal of him. That was the platoon sergeant, Sergeant Thomas in the background. In this particular scene, we had just engaged an enemy sampan, which is right there. It was a 40-foot sampan with twin 51 cals on it. We're coming across the river early in the morning and saw a cooking fire coming up out of the trees, and so rolled over it and did a quick right turn and looked right down into a sampan full of troops. And so after we engaged it with the minigun, we got the thing to sinking. and then we put the ARPs on the ground to develop the situation. You can see the sampan burning, it's right there. And then this is me working that area before the ARPs get on the ground. And then if you look right here, these are the ARPs coming up that tree line toward the sampan where they would surveil it on the ground. So you can see from our vantage point, we could see much better than they could. And we took it as an obligation to keep these guys from getting ambushed. They were our unit, our people. We ate with them. We partied with them. Wayne McAdoo, the platoon commander of the Aero Lift platoon, I would simply say this is the only Huey in Vietnam that had a wood dashboard from J.C. Whitney Company. His crew chief ordered it through the mail, and it's the stick-on. Those of you who are old enough to remember, it's on the dashboard. It must have taken him weeks to do that, and the troop commander never said a word. It was his aircraft. Once the guys are ready to go on the ground, each of the squad leaders carried recognition panels in their helmet, and they would pop a smoke for the lead aircraft to come in. The infantry would deploy outside to guard the formation and set up the aircraft for recovery, 4 different locations in line. And the guy with the panel just stood there until the Huey popped right in on top of him and put the nose right there in his tummy. This is Joe Henry Bad. Joe Bad was killed November 1969. One of my great losses in the scout platoon. Joe was scouting with a young enlisted gunner named Leslie Downing from Green City, Missouri. And he saw an enemy soldier in the field run from him, and so Joe did a quick turn to go around and try to capture him. And while running dead speed across an open field with an M1 carbine, the individual fired wildly over his right shoulder and struck Joe in the forehead. Killed on impact, rolled inverted, and crashed, killing Joe and Leslie. The fun part about this picture, though, is this is Chico. Chico is a Vietnamese monkey. A lot of the guys had monkeys. I found them detestable, and they would not share their food. This building is the captain's hooch. All the hooches had warrant officers and lieutenants living in it except the captain's hooch. And what made the captain's hooch different is they had external potable water and an interior shower. That is their potable water tank in the back. Joe Bad taught Chico to climb up on the water tank, open the top, and poop and pee in it, which went on for weeks until the captains finally figured out about it, and that's when Chico departed the troop area, never to be seen again. Interesting, very quick story. Joe had a daughter, and she was an infant daughter when Joe was killed. Her name was Lisa. And I was sitting at home one night, probably 8 months after Low Level Hell was released, and the phone rings, and this petite feminine voice says, "You don't know me, but my name is Lisa Bad." And I said, "I know exactly who you are. You're Joe Bad's daughter." Joe was from New York, and when I wrote the book, I tried to find his family but could not. I didn't realize his wife was Nova Scotian. And after Joe's death, they moved to Nova Scotia, and Lisa grew up as a flight attendant for Air Nova. So after we conversed a bit, we invited her to come to Missouri, to Kansas City, and visit my wife Sharon and I, and then we put her in a car and took her to Green City, Missouri, to meet the parents of the crew chief who died with her father, which was an interesting time. But Lisa has been a part of our Dark Horse organization since that time and comes to every reunion, brings her husband, her daughter. It's really a very close relationship. Well, some years ago, I get an email from one of my friends in the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association, and he says, do you know a guy named Henry Vadd? And I said, sure, I knew Joe. And he said, well, I just got a communique from the United States Naval Attaché in Nova Scotia, and someone found an Army flight school ring in a parking lot of a gas station in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and they took it to the U.S. Attaché in the consulate and said, someone lost this. And I said, well, I know exactly who that belongs to because Joe's dead. Joe was killed in Vietnam, and his daughter lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So we were able to use that information. I called Lisa and said, is there anything about your father's flight school ring you want to tell me? And she said, well, I lost it in a burglary of my home 6 or 8 months ago. I said, if you will go down to the Naval Attaché's office in Halifax, Nova Scotia, they will give you the ring back. So if you get on Google and you Google Joe Vadd's ring, you can read that whole story. That is an absolute coincidence that I can't account for by anything other than Joe Vadd is still looking out after Lisa Vadd. We'll back up. I'm going to back up one. That's Texas Horseshoes. That's the end. But I flew Cobras the middle tour between 2 tours flying scouts. On the 30th of January 1972, I was knocked down in Laos by either an SA-7 or an 85 millimeter. I think it was an 85. My wingman thought it was a missile. But in any event, we spent a couple of days on the ground. My gunner and I, he was in the front seat and was very badly injured. I had a broken leg and was kind of banged up, but I was much better than he was. I talk bad about the Air Force all the time because I can. But I will tell you, it was the 37th Aero Rescue and Recovery Squadron that brought myself and John Bryant home. It was a PJ named Harvey J. Picklesheimer. Can you imagine being a parajumper with the name Picklesheimer? It was his first time on the ground. It was the aircraft commander's first time to do a rescue in combat. It was my first time to be rescued by the Air Force. And this is me getting hauled up into the rescue helicopter. John had gone just ahead of me. And I don't know why I'm going that way. I'm going this way. And that is the end of what I was going to talk about. This is Horseshoes in Texas. We used to do that at Fort Hood. The wives, for some reason, would never play. I don't know why. They said it was nasty, but we cleaned these very well before we used them. What I've attempted to do tonight is just give you an overview of what an Air Cavalry pilot experienced in Vietnam. How many helicopter pilots in the room? Are there any other? I saw him nodding his head over here. What did you fly? Cobras. Okay. I don't talk much bad about Cobra pilots. Chinook pilots, I got nothing good to say about Chinook pilots. The reason I'm standing here today is the Cobra pilots that flew over me every single day. I can name every one of them for you. We get together every year in Dark Horse, and we don't generally go to the VHPA conventions, and we don't do that because the Helicopter Pilots Association will not let our crew chiefs go. All of my scout gunners were crew chiefs. They also won't let our aero rifle guys go, and I will tell you that the bond between the aero riflemen and the scout gunners and the scout and Cobra pilots is so great that we go to the crew members meetings now because we want to see our guys. We just had the last one 4 months ago in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and we do this every year. But the reason I'm here today is very, very good gunners in the back seat that would go wherever I took them, and Cobra pilots that would get me out of what I got myself into. So with that, I very much appreciate your attention. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.